Who was brave enough or desperate enough to become New York City's first steeplejack? Between 1870 and 1890, Manhattan surged skyward. Steeples, towers, early skyscrapers, faster than any safety code could follow. Someone had to climb them. No harnesses, no regulations, just manila rope rated for 1,200 pounds and whatever nerve you had left. Most were immigrants who'd barely arrived before scaling heights above 150 feet. In 1889, 2 fell to their deaths from St. Patrick's Cathedral. The insurer denied every claim. The city wrote no new law. To understand how this trade was born, you have to understand how fast New York was rising and how little it cared about the men it sent up. By the late 19th century, Manhattan's skyline was transforming faster than anyone could regulate or even fully comprehend. In just 2 decades, the number of buildings rising above 150 feet more than doubled, crowding the horizon with spires, domes, and the first steel-framed towers. Sanborn fire insurance maps from 1884 and 1890 show a city erupting upward, new black squares and spire symbols marking each fresh addition, each one a new challenge for anyone tasked with keeping them standing tall. Developers and architects seized every available lot, stacking floors atop floors, pushing for height records and prestige. The Equitable Life Building, with its elevators and steel skeleton, set a new standard in 1870. By 1890, the New York World Building soared over 300 feet, casting shadows across City Hall Park. Church steeples, once the city's tallest landmarks, now found themselves surrounded by commercial towers and water tanks. The vertical race was on, but there were no rules for how to keep these new giants safe. Municipal codes of the era read like relics from a flatter world. A close review of the city's building and health ordinances, line by line, reveals a striking omission. Not a single clause addresses the risks of working above a certain height. Regulations focused on fire, sanitation, and crowding, never the perils of wind or gravity. No law required a harness, a guardrail, or even a second rope for a man working 200 feet above the pavement. The absence of legal protection was as stark as the open sky above. These codes offered no help for work at altitude. This legal vacuum left a dangerous gap. As more towers rose, so did the need for men who could climb them, who could replace a flagpole on Trinity Church, patch a leak atop St. Patrick's, or repair the ironwork of a water tower perched above tenement roofs. The city's rapid ascent outpaced not only its codes, but also its imagination for how such work should be done. Maintenance crews faced problems no one had solved before: how to anchor a scaffold to a spire, how to haul a pane of glass to the lantern of a Gothic tower, how to steady yourself against a gust of wind with nothing but rope and instinct. The vacuum at the top was literal and legal. The job demanded a new kind of worker, someone with the nerve to climb where no one else dared, and the skill to improvise solutions with whatever materials were at hand. These men became known as Steeplejacks, though their title was rarely written into contracts or city ledgers. Their work was invisible until disaster struck. When a rope snapped or a scaffold gave way, the city's newspapers might take notice for a day. But the codes remained silent, and the skyline kept rising. From the perspective of an urban planner, this was both a marvel and a warning. New York's ambition had created a city of towers, but it had left a void at the very top, a place where law and labor met only in the courage of the men who climbed. The need for a specialized trade was no longer theoretical. It was an urgent, unsolved problem, suspended above a city that looked up, wondered, and waited for someone to take the risk. High above the city's noise, steeplejacks start where the architect's plans stop. Their job is simple to describe, but hard to do. Keep the unreachable parts of buildings standing. They patch leaks, reset iron crosses, replace battered flagpoles, tasks that would make most roofers think twice. Each contract is a challenge. Swap out a weathercock on a church spire, reclad copper on a dome, secure a stone finial before it crashes to the street. The work changes daily. One morning it is hauling glass up to the lantern of St. Patrick's. The next, tightening bolts on a wind-battered water tower or scraping rust from the iron ribs of an office block 10 stories high. Unlike other trades, steeplejacks rarely set foot on solid ground. Their platforms might be a plank lashed to a spire or a cage of pine joists dangling from ropes. Climbing is part of the job, shinnying up stone, squeezing through trapdoors, swinging out with only a harness and nerve. The city's first steeplejacks worked on contract, hired job by job, sometimes through church vestries, sometimes by private owners, often by word of mouth. Payment was usually piece rate, a set fee for each completed task, no matter how long it took or how dangerous it was. If a flagpole snapped in a storm, it was the steeplejack's phone that rang. The expectation was simple: get up there, fix it, and come down alive. Their duties went far beyond repairs. Steeplejacks inspected ironwork for corrosion, replaced shattered panes in lantern towers, and spliced ropes for block and tackle rigs. They repainted gilded crosses, hammered loose bricks back into place, and cleared pigeon nests from bell frames. Some jobs meant hauling up hundreds of pounds of glass, copper, or timber using only muscle and a block and tackle slung over a weathered beam. Others demanded the precision of a surgeon, resetting a lightning rod without cracking the stone beneath, or adjusting a bell's clapper so the note rang true at noon. Steeplejack work was improvisation in the face of the unknown. No two climbs were the same, and no manual could prepare a man for the wind that whipped around a cathedral's peak or the way a rope might creak under sudden strain. Official records might list them as carpenters or masons, but among themselves they knew the difference. To be a steeplejack was to take the jobs others refused, and to do them with quiet pride. Their work was invisible until something failed, but every secure spire and gleaming dome in Manhattan owed its survival to their hands. Every morning, the city's newest immigrants spilled from the ferries and trains, clutching battered trunks and paper-wrapped bundles. Their names filled the ledgers at Castle Garden: O'Rourke from Cork, Schreiber from Hamburg, Ritchie from Malmo. Between 1870 and 1890, more than 1 million newcomers passed through Manhattan's port, chasing work wherever it could be found. For a handful, the path led skyward. The census rolls and union rosters of the era read like a roll call of risk-takers. Steeplejacks rarely appeared under that name. More often they were listed as riggers, carpenters, or ironworkers. Yet the pattern is clear. Most were young men, single or recently married, with origins scattered across Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia. Shipyard riggers who could tie a splice blindfolded, masons who'd learned to trust their footing on narrow ledges, and carpenters with a knack for building scaffolds that clung to church spires like barnacles. The city's need for men who could climb, improvise, and endure heights turned these skills into a calling. Apprenticeship was less a formal contract than a survival pact. A boy might start as a runner, hauling rope and tools up winding staircases, watching the older men knot lines and test beams with a practiced kick. Instruction happened on the job, in the shadow of a steeple or the wind-blown roof of a tenement. The first lessons were simple: tie every knot twice, never trust a new rope, check the weather before you climb. The rest, the patience, the nerve, the instinct to grip iron with frozen fingers, came with time and luck. Indenture records from the municipal archives show the shape of these arrangements. Michael Schreiber, a ship rigger by trade, signed a 3-year apprenticeship with a master carpenter on Fifth Avenue in 1872. The contract promised board, $1 a week, and the right to learn every part of the work: rope splicing, scaffold building, the rigging of block and tackle. Patrick O'Malley, newly arrived from Galway, was hired in 1876 by Trinity Church's vestry, his name inked into the maintenance ledger beside a list of repairs and a payment for steeple work. Many learned their trade in silence, watching repairs high above the streets, never knowing if their own name would one day be written in the city's ledgers or in the accident reports. The risk was understood but rarely spoken aloud. A slip could mean a funeral with no marker, but a line in a church's book. Yet the draw was irresistible. For some, the heights offered escape from the crush of the city below, a sense of mastery over space and fear. For others, it was simply work that paid a little better than the docks, with the added promise of pride and reputation if a job went well. By 1885, city census tables estimate nearly 3/4 of steeplejacks were foreign-born, most with backgrounds in rigging, carpentry, or ironwork. Their knowledge crossed languages and borders, the German habit of double-checking every knot, the Irish tradition of climbing church towers as a rite of passage, the Scandinavian patience for working in wind and cold. Each brought something essential to the craft, and together they formed a human pipeline that kept the city's highest points standing. Their stories rarely made headlines, but in the ledgers, the census, and the union cards, a picture emerges. A brotherhood of men who learned from each other, who risked everything for the chance to look down on the city from above, and who, in doing so, helped shape not only the skyline, but the spirit of New York itself. Rope was the Steeplejack's first and last safeguard. Manila, 3-strand, thick as a thumb, was the standard, its fibers spun from abaca, tough enough to face rain, sun, and the sharp pull of gravity. Hardware catalogs in the 1880s rated a 1/4-inch Manila rope at 1,200 pounds, enough to support a man, his tools, and a stone finial, with a margin for the unknown. Every rope was checked, then checked again, knotted with a rigger's eye, and only trusted after it stretched under a man's own weight. The first lesson: trust the rope only after you've felt it strain in your hands. Leather harnesses cut from full-grain hide wrapped the body in a rough, reassuring grip. The standard belt ran 2 inches wide, fastened with brass buckles and a steel plate across the hips. Some men added shoulder loops or cross straps to keep the load from digging in. The harness didn't guarantee safety. It spread the force when the rope snapped tight and kept a man from pitching backward into space. Each belt was custom-fitted, patched and restitched as needed, its scars marking close calls and long days above the city. Block and tackle rigs turned muscle into leverage. A 4-to-1 tackle, the workhorse of the trade, let one man hoist 4 times his own weight. Brass sheaves spun inside wooden blocks, rope threaded through until a heavy load could be lifted with a steady pull. For bigger jobs, a 6-to-1 rig was built. Ropes doubled and run through extra blocks to share the strain. The math was as important as the grip: count the lines, count the load, and know that every pound mattered when you worked 200 feet above the street. Scaffolding was always temporary. Steeplejacks built their own platforms from pine joists and manila cord, assembling what they called a cage, a lattice 3 feet high, braced at the corners by iron turnbuckles. The cage could be raised in sections, tied off to a spire, or bolted to an iron cross brace. When the job was done, the whole rig came down, leaving only the memory of the climb. Hardware catalogs offered pre-drilled scaffold kits, but most men trusted their own improvisations, whatever fit the angle, the weather, and the stone beneath their boots. Patents from the late 19th century show a constant push for better tools. An 1878 improved hoisting block promised smoother lifts with an iron sheave, while an 1889 harness patent added a reinforced steel plate for safer load distribution. These inventions offered small comforts, but most steeplejacks relied on what they could build, repair, or adapt on the fly. Photographs from the era show men perched on timber cages, rope slung over a shoulder, belt cinched tight, no safety net, just the tools they trusted and the nerve to use them. Physics was a daily test. A 700-pound safe load on a 3/4-inch rope, a scaffold's bending stress kept under 2,000 pounds per square inch, a tackle's mechanical advantage calculated in the head while wind rattled the boards. Every ascent was a judgment. How much weight could the rope take? How far could the cage sway? When would the next gust threaten to undo it all? Mistakes were measured in inches and seconds, the only warning a creak of timber or the sudden slack of a knot. For these men, tools were more than equipment. They were extensions of muscle, habit, and instinct. Each morning began with a ritual: check the rope, test the harness, run a hand along each block and tackle, and trust only what you could see, feel, and tie yourself. In the absence of law or regulation, these materials and methods became the unwritten code of survival. The city's skyline was their proving ground, and every steeple that stood another year was quiet proof of their craft. Permits filed with the Department of Buildings in the 1880s and the 1890s read like a secret ledger of New York's vertical ambitions. Steeplejacks answered calls from every corner of Manhattan. Their skills summoned wherever stone, iron, or timber reached too high for ordinary hands. The range of their assignments reveals just how indispensable they had become to the city's new order. St. Mark's Church on the Upper East Side stands as one of the earliest documented sites. In 1884, the vestry hired a steeplejack crew to reinforce the bell tower after a lightning strike loosened the iron cross atop its spire. The job required hauling fresh copper sheeting and timber up nearly 180 feet, working at the edge of the bell frame while the city's streetcars rattled below. The church's maintenance ledger records a payment for steeple repairs and cross resetting, a brief line that belies the complexity of the work. On the far west side, the water tower on 71st Street posed a different challenge. Built in 1883, this municipal tank rose above the tenements, its iron shell battered by wind and rain. Maintenance logs from the city's water department detail a steeplejack's task: scraping rust from rivets, resealing seams, and replacing the lightning rod at the very top. Each climb meant bracing against the cold iron, the city's grid stretching out in every direction, the only safety a trusted rope and the rhythm of practiced hands. Downtown, the New York Times building at 41 Wall Street brought the trade into the age of steel. Between 1889 and 1891, steeplejacks rigged block and tackle systems to inspect the iron beams and tighten facade anchors on the rising office tower. Department of Buildings permits list tower rigging and inspection as required for occupancy, acknowledging, if only in bureaucratic language, that the city's tallest new structures could not open without their work. Each of these sites demanded a different mix of nerve, skill, and improvisation. From the Gothic lines of St. Mark's to the industrial muscle of a water tower and the modern ambition of a steel-framed office block, steeplejacks moved between worlds. Their assignments left no part of the skyline untouched, and their presence, though rarely celebrated, was woven into the city's upward climb. Wind. At these heights is never just background noise. It presses against the spire, slips through gaps in the timber, and turns the city's distant roar into something like the sea. Every steeplejack learns to read it before trusting their life to the ropes. The day starts with a ritual, standing on the roof, watching scraps of paper spin, testing the air with a wetted finger, listening for the low moan that warns of a coming gust. If the wind's wrong, the climb waits. If it's right, hands move along the rope, searching for frays, checking each knot twice. Apprentices watch, learning that survival is built on habits repeated without fail. There's a silent code up here. Words are rare, but every gesture matters. A nod means it's time. A tap on the line signals all clear. The most important lessons aren't spoken. How to tie a rigger's bend by feel. How to test a plank with your boot before trusting it. How to breathe slow and steady when the city drops away beneath you. Apprenticeship isn't taught in words. It's absorbed in quiet, in the shadow of the spire, through ritual and repetition. The city below shrinks to patterns of rooftops and steam. The air is sharper, every sense tuned to the work. Fingers numb against stone, harness creaking, rope scraping brick. The rhythm is constant. Inspect the knot, test the line, move with care. There's no room for bravado. Each movement is deliberate, shaped by stories passed down, of slips, snapped ropes, scars that never fully heal. These stories aren't told outright, but everyone knows them. They're woven into the double check, the silent prayer, the way a man looks at his hands before he climbs. Lunch comes on the ledge, legs swinging over the void, bread and cheese unwrapped with careful hands. Conversation is spare. Trust the rope, trust your partner, trust your nerve, never the wind, never the stone. On a cool May morning in 1889, Fifth Avenue woke to the sound of hammers tapping against marble, a scaffold rising like a skeleton against the southern spire of St. Patrick's Cathedral. 4 men, names lost to the city's ledgers, climbed into place, their boots scraping pine planks, leather harnesses tightened by habit and hope. The job was to hoist a 12-foot timber beam to the ironwork high above, and patch a seam before the spring rains found their way in. Below, the city's traffic pressed on, carriages rattling past, heads tilted upward for a moment, then turned away. The wind that day was fickle, a sharp gust, then a lull. Witnesses later recalled the scaffold swaying, ropes drawn taut as the men worked in silence. Then, with no warning, the central rope snapped. The cage lurched sideways, planks splintered. 3 men tumbled against the stone cornice. 2 fell, their descent broken only by the marble steps far below. The 4th, bruised and bloodied, clung to a twisted beam until a fireman's ladder reached him. The crowd on Fifth Avenue froze, then parted as the bodies were carried down, hats in hand. The city's pulse stilled for a moment by the sight of what the skyline demanded. The next morning's papers ran the story above the fold. The New York Times called it a calamity on the cathedral. The Tribune published a sketch, tiny figures, scaffold in ruins, the spire looming above. But the questions came later in the coroner's inquest. Why had the bracing failed? Who had checked the knots? Testimony revealed a scaffold built in haste, without adequate cross-bracing, the wood repurposed from an earlier job, the rope frayed at the splice. The verdict was accidental death, the result of insufficient lateral support. No charges filed, no names memorialized. When the widows filed claims with Mutual Fire and Marine, the answer came back in dry legalese: occupational hazard, claim denied. The trade's silence held. No union, no compensation, no marker, but a line in a coroner's book. The city moved on, the spire repaired, the scaffold rebuilt. But for those who climbed, the lesson was written in scar tissue and memory. The skyline's beauty was paid for in risk, and the price was sometimes everything a man had to give. On a summer morning in 1892, as the city's heat shimmered off the stone and glass of lower Manhattan, a single figure captured New York's restless imagination. High above the streets, balanced atop the torch of the Statue of Liberty, an anonymous steeplejack posed for a photograph that would soon circle the globe. The image, published in the New York Times on July 6th, showed a man standing where no ordinary citizen could follow, boots planted on the copper flame, the harbor sprawling far below. Crowds gathered along Battery Park and the ferry landings, necks craned, hands shading eyes, watching for any sign of movement on the distant crown. A few, lucky enough to own opera glasses, passed them back and forth, pointing and gasping as the climber shifted his stance, waved a cap, and seemed for a moment to defy both gravity and common sense. Reporters jotted down fragments of conversation. "He is mad, that one," said a dock worker. "No, he is a hero," countered a shopgirl. The Tribune quoted a schoolboy. "He is as high as the clouds, higher than the mayor." The photograph became an instant sensation. Within days, prints appeared in shop windows from City Hall to Harlem, sold for a nickel apiece. Editorials framed the image as proof of American nerve, a living symbol of the city's drive to reach ever higher. Some called the Steeplejack a daredevil, others a patriot, but all agreed on one thing: no one else could do what he did. The Illustrated American ran a cartoon showing the climber planting a flag on the torch, with the caption, "The Republic's Sentinel." For the public, the trade took on a mythic quality. The steeplejack was no longer just a worker with rope and harness. He was the city's own skywalker, a figure who made the impossible seem almost ordinary. His presence atop the torch turned dangerous labor into spectacle, and for a brief moment, the crowds below looked up not with dread, but with wonder. The city's appetite for height, for spectacle, for the edge between risk and achievement, found its perfect emblem in that solitary man above the harbor. The photograph fixed his silhouette in memory, but his name was never recorded. In the city's imagination, he became every man who ever dared to climb higher than the rest. A modern high-rise crew gathers before dawn at St. Paul's Chapel, their gear lined up with military precision on the stone steps. The team lead, Michael DeLuca, checks his full-body OSHA certified harness with triple-locking carabiners and a bright orange lanyard rated to stop a 2,200-pound fall. Each worker carries a digital badge that logs their ascent and a phone app that tracks every minute above ground. Before anyone climbs, a supervisor runs through the safety checklist, anchor points, fall arrest systems, rescue plan, and weather report. Nothing is left to chance. Today, every detail is governed by code. OSHA Regulation 29 CFR 1926 spells out the minimum requirements for fall protection, mandating guardrails, harnesses, and redundant lines for any work above 6 feet. The New York City Building Code adds its own layers. Section 2-1225 requires a written safety plan, signed off by both engineer and contractor. Every harness must meet ANSIZ 359 standards. Ropes are synthetic, tested to 3 times their working load, and replaced on a strict schedule. Digital documentation logs every inspection, every incident, every training session. The crew moves with a practiced rhythm. 2 workers secure the baselines, threading dynamic rope through steel eye bolts anchored to the spire's frame. Another checks the electronic fall arrest system, a device that can sense a sudden drop and lock in milliseconds. Ladders are lashed, platforms leveled with laser tools, and every step is double-checked by a second set of eyes. Even the weather is monitored in real time. Gusts above 20 miles per hour mean a mandatory halt. Yet despite all the technology and regulation, the core of the work remains unchanged. The job still demands nerve, balance, and respect for the wind. Modern steeplejacks talk about feeling the building sway and about the silence that settles 100 feet above the city. They know the history written into every bolt and beam, and they carry a quiet pride in doing work that most people can only imagine. The skyline still needs its caretakers, and the risk, though managed and measured, is never truly gone. Each climb is a link between past and present, a reminder that even in an age of codes and contracts, some jobs are built on trust, courage, and the willingness to step out where the ground falls away. At sunrise on July 4, 1890, rumors swept through Wall Street. A flag would be raised atop Trinity Church's spire, and John, known as Jack O'Connor, a steeplejack and risk-taker, was the man for the job. By 8 o'clock, the sidewalks were crowded. Brokers, clerks, and newsboys pressed against the church fence, eyes fixed on the spire. The vestry ledger from that week records a payment, flagstaff ascent and replacement. O'Connor, $18. O'Connor started from the belfry, 135 feet above the street. The climb was unforgiving, stones slick with dew, iron rungs polished by years of storms. His harness, patched and worn, dug into his shoulders. He carried the new flag rolled tight, rope over one arm, hammer at his belt. With each step, the city's noise faded, replaced by wind and the sound of his own breath. Halfway up, O'Connor stopped to check his knots. He tied them twice, then again, as every steeplejack did. Below, the crowd watched in silence, Wall Street's usual roar stilled by the sight of one man inching skyward. A gust snapped his coat. Some gasped, others crossed themselves. O'Connor kept climbing, boots scraping narrow stone, hands raw from rope. There was no guardrail, no safety net, only nerve and skill. At the top, O'Connor unrolled the flag, tied it fast, and stood alone above the city. The crowd erupted, hats waving, voices rising in a cheer that bounced off marble facades. The New York Times headline the next day called it a feat of daring that thrilled the heart of Wall Street. O'Connor waved once, then began his careful descent, the city's colors flying higher than ever before. The vestry's single payment line remains, quiet testimony to a moment when the city looked up, awed by the courage of a man whose name most would soon forget. The city's towers gleam, but their shadows stretch long, cast by men whose names history never learned. Today, safety harnesses and regulations protect those who climb, yet the skyline's foundation remains a testament to raw nerve and invention. Every spire above us is an echo, proof that progress is built not only on vision, but on the courage to face the void. The skyline endures, so do the risks and the bravery behind every ascent.